Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the What is Money Show. I am sitting down today with Dr. Robert Malone. Robert, you became very famous recently, kind of catapulted into the global spotlight on Joe Rogan podcast number 1757, which has been, I believe, ranked as the number one podcast episode worldwide recently, seen by over 50 million viewers. And some are calling this episode the most important interview of our time. So, Dr. Malone, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind words. It did. We knew it was going to be a big deal because Peter McCullough's preceding one went to 40 million. Hopefully, I haven't hurt Peter's ego, but it happened.
Well, I think it is very important. It's clearly a major topic in the world today, and there's a lot of confusion and controversy surrounding it. So before we jump in to these topics, maybe it would be useful for you to just do the 3-minute version of your bona fides for the audience.
So I'm a physician and scientist. I'm licensed to practice medicine in the state of Maryland, and that license is still active, although there's a physician in Maui that's trying to take it away from me. Thanks for that. A little local flavor. Let's see. I went to Northwestern University Medical School, UC Davis in biochemistry, Salk Institute, and the molecular biology and virology labs in UC San Diego for my master's degree in lieu of a PhD, where I had this series of discoveries that resulted in 9 issued patents that formed the basic platform for mRNA and DNA vaccines. I was an academic to rank of associate professor in surgery, actually, but mostly in pathology. I reached associate professor at Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. So that's the Department of Defense Medical School in Bethesda, Maryland. I've served at UC Davis, U Maryland, other universities. I have completed 2 research fellowships. I've graduated from Harvard Medical School as a global clinical research scholar. And I've had an active academic career with multiple patents and inventions and startups and all that kind of stuff. I've spent time hawking business plans on Silicon Valley and in Torrey Pines Road in La Jolla. So I understand that world. I've worked for Harris Global TB Vaccine Foundation, which was one of the early Gatelets, early Bill and Melinda Gates founded companies that focused on TB vaccines. I've worked for Solvay Pharmaceuticals, so that's big pharma. So NGO, big pharma, academia, and then a ton of time working closely with the Department of Defense. Also, as often as a chief medical officer or something analogous at various smaller clinical contract research organizations and regulatory affairs shops that are closely aligned with the FDA. So I'm knowledgeable and experienced in designing and implementing clinical trials and regulatory affairs, FDA documents. I spent way too much time at ACIP meetings at the CDC. I've spent tons of time dealing with FDA folks and with the big players in the HHS biomedical enterprise like BARDA. I have a lifetime win rate of over $8 billion, either won or managed in grants contracts. That's with a B. So I'm one of these few folks that kind of crosses all of these different domains. I really have been an insider. That's not an ego speaking. I just am. But traditionally, somebody pointed out to me the other day, I used to say, if they can't see you, they can't shoot you. And I tried really hard to stay below the radar until all this stuff broke loose and the Brett Weinstein podcast happened. But that's kind of been my traditional stance. And throughout my career, I've worked really closely with the Department of Defense and the Office of the Navy. And my first major contract, was for over $1 million for an AIDS vaccine in 1991, AIDS DNA vaccine development. That was with the Navy. And currently I work mostly with Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which is the branch of the DoD that is responsible for mitigating a variety of threats, nuclear and biologic and chemical. And they have two main branches. One is threat risk reduction, mitigation. That's the group that continues to fund the Wuhan lab, by the way. And then the group I work with is Chem Biodefense Group. And they're the ones that are busy thinking about how do we protect, particularly the warfighter population, from the new biologic threats and chemical threats that are emerging all over the world. So I have had a secret clearance granted from DoD. It's currently inactive. I have had many interactions with the intelligence community. I've co-published with a CIA officer. So all that's true. I don't work for the CIA, never have. I don't work for DARPA, never have, but I have been at DARPA. So I think that's a kind of a good synopsis of my past history.
Thank you for that. Sounds like you've had quite the decorated career, exposure to a lot of different areas that are all pertinent to this current global situation. So look, as I was saying offline, I've got a few areas I want to walk through with you. And I think one that would be useful to get started, just to warm up, is just this concept of medical ethics. And admittedly, this is an area I don't have a lot of knowledge on, so forgive me for any silly questions or anything like that. But let's start here. This idea of informed consent. What does that mean? Is it being attacked or affected through all the recent regulations that have come out around COVID? And is that and how does that relate, I guess, to a censorable offense? In informed consent, in my understanding, meaning that the patient should have all data and knowledge about a treatment before making a decision on that treatment. How does that relate to the censorable offenses or censorship we're seeing in the world right now?
Okay, so that touches right on the hot button of big tech and the indemnification that has been granted to pharma and whether it extends to tech and media. The question you're asking is one of the hottest topics right now legally. So overview of informed consent. This concept really goes back to the Nuremberg trials. Remember, the context is Nazi Germany doctors experimenting on Jewish or other prisoner / individuals, I won't call them patients. And much of that related to the logic that it was for the greater good, because the Third Reich armies were confronting a hostile cold environment on the Moscow front, and as they pushed towards the Arctic Circle with Iceland, etc., in Norway, and so they were encountering cold environment conditions, and there was experimentation performed on unwilling prisoners and others to test various interventions that would be useful in helping protect troops that were subjected to these harsh weather conditions. And it was justified that it was appropriate to use these individuals against their will in these medical experiments because it was for the greater good of the Third Reich, just to set the stage. And so when we learned about that, to be honest. Some of those individuals became members of our rocketry program, and others were identified as having made substantial transgressions and brought before the Nuremberg trials and hung to death. As a decision was made by the Western winning coalition that this was ethically unacceptable to force individuals to undertake medical procedures for purposes of human subjects research without informing them of the risks and obtaining their full, willing, and uncoerced consent to participate in the medical experimentation. That was a big series of statements, the Nuremberg Accords. And there's actually, in the current outbreak, oddly enough, or not oddly, there's a new push to revise those agreements so that forced vaccination with experimental products would be considered acceptable. This is part of the whole push to kind of engineer our vocabulary, with words like anti-vaxxer being extended to apply to anybody who is against vaccine mandates. And then that there was some kind of slippage away from global Western commitment to these standard ethics. They were never really bought off by Eastern nations like China, People's Republic. So there was some kind of drifting away from those ethics. And so there was another meeting that led to the Helsinki Accords that reinforced these principles and codified them more clearly. And then in the United States, we again strayed from the straight and narrow with things like the Tuskegee Experiment. It's not the only example, which is, given rise to deep wariness by the African American population in dealing with the CDC and clinical research in general. So that prompted another revision and rethinking of all this in the United States that is called the Belmont Report. And then the Belmont Report was codified in federal law. I don't remember the specific CFR numbers, CFR 45 something or other. What is it, Joel?
Common rule.
Yeah, it's common. It's called the common rule it's generically, so you can look up common rule as laying out the ethics of experimentation in medical research and in general for medical practice. So you all understand, you and your audience. Well, you're too young. You haven't had a colonoscopy yet. I'm sure. I'm older. So you have something to look forward to. But any medical procedure that you've gone in for, or you may go in for, you look like you probably have hardly ever been in the hospital. But normally there is a disclosure of risks and benefits, and often it's not comprehensive, but the physician or surgeon that wishes to perform the procedure is recommending it. You have the right to question that person to the extent necessary for you to feel like you have had your questions answered. It's fundamental in terms of medical practice. There is in medical training, there is an awareness and a recognition that some patients like to be told what to do. That's just the truth. Mm-hmm. And so for some patients, I can tell you that when you approach them with this kind of more rigorous informed consent stance, they kind of said, "Doc, just tell me what to do and I'll do it." But you have to offer the full disclosure, and that's particularly true. So since I do clinical research, I have to be rigorously trained in this, and it gets reinforced. And frankly, if I veer from the straight and narrow, I am at risk for losing my ability to practice my craft of clinical research. So it's that fundamental. And in clinical research, for obvious reasons, it's particularly so that one does not enforce a medical procedure or an unlicensed medical product onto somebody without full disclosure of risks as deep as they want to go, and willing concurrence to accept the medical procedure for whatever reason, but it cannot be coerced, it cannot be enticed, it cannot be compelled. In the current situation, we fail on all three of those criteria because we have had coercion. That's the give the kids an ice cream cone to give them a jab, or shotgun lottery, or whatever the thing is. They cannot be compelled. Well, that's the government telling you have to do this, or coerced or enticed. All of the messaging over the media, get your shot. It's going to be a dark winter for you if you don't take your shot. And all of that is all coercion. So that's technically illegal. And when I make these statements that is, in my opinion, the government's lawless, which, there's a great Daily Mail piece out that fact checked everything I said in the Rogan podcast. And most of the things they verified. The truth is that, in my opinion, I've spoken about the government acting in a lawless and illegal fashion. Mm-hmm. And I think that's easy to demonstrate that by all of the Supreme Court in 6th District Court and other court decisions that have overthrown the various federal mandates. So I think that's not a unjustified position. I think it's supported by the subsequent facts. But the lawlessness of our government through this transcends this, but this is certainly one example of it, in my opinion.
Thank you for that. I'm reminded here that just the Gandhi quote, where he says something to the effect of, civil disobedience becomes our sacred duty when the government grows lawless or corrupt. And we're seeing instances of it everywhere. I did want to double click a little bit on, you mentioned the Tuskegee experiment, which was the Tuskegee syphilis study, I believe. I wasn't talking about the airmen. I actually wasn't aware of this until I heard you mention it on the Rogan podcast, and I did a little digging on it. Really? Would you mind just maybe giving the 5-minute breakdown of what that was? Because I was surprised I hadn't heard about it. I mean, I've studied a lot of history, but I just was completely blind to this one.
So, and it's fascinating. This was brought to fore by a whistleblower, a federal whistleblower, and it really came to a head and changed national policy and led to the Belmont Report by the advocacy of one Edward Kennedy. One of the great things that he did Edward Kennedy. Right, we're talking about the congressman, Jill. So it was one of the positions that he took strongly, is forcing the government to come to terms with this multi-decade study that was performed with largely African Americans that had acquired syphilis or might have been given syphilis, and were denied, were basically not told that they had this disease. And ostensibly it was run, they were allowed to remain infectious and infected, and carefully followed to be able to document the effects of neurosyphilis on human beings. Really not so different from, in terms of the ethics, from what happened that triggered the Nuremberg trials. Clearly, I think anybody with a soul, a modicum of understanding of human dignity and the importance of respect for human dignity would recognize that just withholding treatment for syphilis in a population alone when they've been diagnosed is unethical, let alone performing an active experiment where they're followed for years and allowed to live in their community. So decades long, U.S. government, basically CDC, grossly unethical. And you may not have heard about it, but I guarantee the African American community is intensely aware of what happened to them in that context. And it has destroyed their willingness, for good reason, to participate in medical research in general.
Yeah, so it was quite horrible on the research that I did on it. I'll read just one small excerpt here. It said, this is in regards to the Public Health Service, which I guess was in conjunction with the CDC administration.
Yeah, Public Health Service it has morphed. CDC started off basically focused on malaria, which is why I was in Atlanta. And back then, actually, a lot of sexually transmitted diseases were marked down as being due to malaria because it was more politically acceptable.
I'll read this one small excerpt here. It says, of these men, 399 had latent syphilis with a control group of 201 men who were not infected. As an incentive for participation in the study, the men were promised free medical care, while the men were provided with both medical and mental care that they otherwise would not have received. They were deceived by the Public Health Service, who never informed them of their syphilis diagnosis and provided disguised placebos, ineffective methods, and diagnostic procedures as treatment for quote unquote bad blood. And I think it goes on to say here that it was penicillin, I think, was a treatment for this that was, I guess, discovered during the trial, but not offered to the patients themselves. So,
correct.
Despite there being an effective treatment out there, it was withheld. So, yeah, really bad. So what? We'll get into follow the money after this, but what is the incentive to do something like that? What do you, in your mind?
Incentive. Academic recognition. It's hard for me to understand also why people would behave in this way. It's all as somebody, for me, as somebody committed to respecting human dignity. A lot of these things, even down to the EcoHealth Alliance activities, and what makes Tony Fauci tick. I have no idea. I can't resolve that. And I think often it has to do with ego, and often a sense of entitlement, academic entitlement. That the best and the most brilliant, the best and the brightest are. It's appropriate for them to pursue knowledge in whatever direction they feel necessary, and that they're entitled to do so, despite the consequences, because they are the best and the brightest. Is what I've experienced in my life. And this has been the case with, this gain of function research domain is a great example of that kind of logic, where we're entitled to perform these things, basically to satisfy our own curiosity and to disregard the potential consequences. This gets to Oppenheimer's dilemma. Having played the key role in inventing the bomb, and what was it, Shiva, the Indian god that he refers to as the I am become death. The deep angst of somebody who isn't morally bankrupt, who recognizes that their contributions intellectually have damaged the world, and opened up new horrors. But I can tell you that there's a cohort of folks in my world that really truly feel like it's okay to do whatever they think they would like to do, and not to have to follow norms about the risks and the processes of getting approval to do those things. So that's really the essence of the gain of function research R&D that happened with Tony and Peter Daszak. Is these people, Tony denies that it was gain of function research, but we clearly, in the proposal to DARPA that was revealed by the major who pulled it from DARPA and disclosed it to Veritas. It's very clear in those documents that Peter Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance recognized that this is gain of function research. So we have the most senior government official in this whole enterprise space, Tony Fauci, denying in congressional testimony that that what was being done under his funding and under his watch was gain of function research. That's there. What you're touching on with this thread is some fundamental human behaviors. And I know you're a person who's, from what you told me, you think a lot about the interface between human behavior and economics. And I'm of the belief that no amount. I believe that we must revise the biowarfare treaty, and we must increase the penalties for people that transgress in this way. But I'm under no illusion that we'll be able to legislate morality. There will always be people that will cross the line here, and it all sounds like a James Bond movie. Inspector and that kind of stuff, but I'm not a religious person personally. I was raised in the Church of England, but so I understand that logic and that world and some of that language, and I find it useful for some things. But the whole good versus evil thing I've always felt was kind of alien to me. Over the last 2 years, I've come to believe that there truly is evil in the world. And I personally believe that, I don't have to invoke the devil. I believe that one of the major roots of evil is the loss of respect for human dignity is at the core of a lot of these things. And often it's coming from arrogance and hubris. I'm better than you. I'm more deserving of you than you. I don't have to treat you as an equal. But there it is. So there's a good closure to your ethics question area. And I do think we're observing a profound failure in fundamental medical ethics, and unfortunately, it involves top-level officials in our government, and it touches on. I have come to believe that we are truly facing a profound collapse of our entire medical care delivery system, and that it has become deeply corrupted by the pharmaceutical industry, and we are facing the need for a major, decades-long rebuild. It's not going to be easy.
Wow, very powerful. I'm reminded of, I forget the gentleman who wrote this, but he wrote that evil is the knowledge that believes itself complete. So it's almost as if we have this intellectual arrogance or hubris overriding decisions that should involve the heart to some extent.
Well put.
Also, I think it was Dostoevsky said the line between good and evil runs down the heart of every man. And I mean, I look at this through an economic lens often, but the more we centralize our socioeconomic systems, the more detached we are from human dignity. We become the individual making a decision impacting the lives of billions. Those billions are just rows on a spreadsheet to them, right? Or perhaps a statistic.
Well put. So my personal intellectual synthesis along these lines is that when we chose to define humanity using the language of economics, that is the core of the beginning of the depersonalization. I'm not denying the importance of economics, but when we use the language in tools of economics to describe the human condition, then we destroy what makes us human. And in a world in which, I suspect with your audience, they won't consider me a crazy whack job to talk about the World Economic Forum and its amazing infiltration into all of our Western democratic structures, built on the concept of a centralized world government, all for our best, for our best interest. I think that we're. I don't see how you can come through the last 2 years unless you're deep in the mass formation phenomena, and not see that the logic of a centralized decision-making political structure is not in our best interest as a species, and that even if it was in the best interest, this is like the Keystone Cops, this crew. Even if I was somebody that was willing to concede my right to choose, I'm intentionally using the language of Milton Friedman. Even if I was so inclined to give up that right.
Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services, or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin. So now you're segueing nicely into the next topic I wanted to get into, is this follow the money idea that seemed to come up often in your interview with Rogan. You mentioned the Trusted News Initiative, Scientific Technological Elite, transnational investment funds, which I believe include BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and the WEF. Between these interests, they effectively own all of big pharma, all of big tech, all of legacy media. And you mentioned as well, this was shocking to me, that Thomson Reuters is the fact checker on Twitter that has common corporate ownership.
That's true.
With Pfizer. Yeah.
Yep.
So one thing I got wrong, I got fact checked on, is that the current CEO of Reuters is not on the Pfizer board. The prior CEO and chairman of the board is on Pfizer's board.
Gotcha.
So that changed actually during 2020. And so when I originally, I hadn't updated my my database there.
Yeah.
And so I got fact checked because that had been a change. But yeah, the Thomson Reuters is deeply embedded economically in this amazing horizontal integration that the best metaphor I've heard is it's best to think of these companies as divisions of one large company, and then you can understand their coordination.
Interesting. Is this all a case of regulatory capture? Like we've seen this has been on Wall Street, discussed about Wall Street for decades, right? There's the revolving door between, say, a Goldman Sachs and an SEC, right? A guy goes and works at Goldman for a little while, then he'll rotate out, write some rules that Goldman is governed by, and then he'll go back to Goldman and exploit those very rules for profit. Is there a similar dynamic playing out here in healthcare?
It is throughout the entire government. So U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, that's the gig that's played. You're a young attorney, you go to work for USPTO, and then you go become a patent attorney and you bounce back and forth. It's, FDA. So former FDA director Scott Gottlieb is now on the board of Pfizer. It just goes on and on and on. And I like to say the 737 MAX is a clear example of regulatory capture at the federal aviation industry. The chronic senior leadership of U.S. Department of Agriculture by ex-Monsanto leaders is an example of regulatory capture. I spoke about this specifically with Ron Johnson, that particular one. And he's kind of alerted to a lot of these COIs. But when I mentioned the USDA, he said, well, of course, they're Monsanto people because they're the only ones that really understand the whole industry. So that's the pushback counter narrative is, of course, we use these industrial players as we bring them in as government leaders because they're the only ones that truly understand the complexities of these various verticals, right? Using your language, right? These are all verticals. And these are government agencies that are established with a dual mandate. Here's the rub. This is right. I think this is where this flows from. All of this stuff can be traced back to fundamental federal positions and statutes, frankly. And one of them is the logic of all of these agencies is built around the thinking of dual functionality to both promote and regulate their respective industries. And so the CDC has a dual mission, just to pick at one thing. CDC has a dual mission of both promoting and regulating vaccines. But for some reason, the promotion of the vaccines has a much bigger budget than the regulation of vaccines, okay? And then we have, in the case of the FDA, and these companies play long term. They play hardball over decades, just like the WEF does, right? The WEF Young Leaders Program has been in place for 30 years, and they've been placing leaders all over the world for over 30 years. They're playing a long game, and the industries play a long game also. So pharma succeeded in advancing the logic that the taxpayer should not be burdened with the cost of regulating pharma. Pharma should be burdened with that cost. So that was a compelling argument. And in the push for deregulation and for unburdening the taxpayer, that was a winning argument on the Hill, supported by a massive lobbying budget, of course. And then once that was in place, then we came to a situation in a gradualistic way where about 60% of the budget of the FDA comes from the pharmaceutical industry. So if you're getting paid by the industry that you regulate, you are likely to listen to their concerns, don't you think? And you've got to be naive to not see this coming. And that kind of logic pervades the entire federal government with all of these agencies. As I mentioned, USDA, FDA, FAA, CDC, BARDA is essentially there to advance the biodefense industry. And then, of course, we have our friends at the Department of Defense, which I'm honored to work with, but their hands are not clean here either. We were warned about this, of course, famously, when President Eisenhower left office. He not only warned about the military-industrial complex, he also warned, and there's, people circulate these clips on social media these days. He also warned about the rise of the medical-industrial complex, which was largely driven by Rockefeller money. That's a whole nother story. Jill's got a Substack ready to come out on that one. But often these things are promoted for the best of reasons, but often they serve long-term commercial interests. And that's just the nature of our democracy, I think, is if people can be lulled into positions where they're not paying attention or distracted by other crises, then there become opportunities to take advantage of that to advance the long-term commercial objectives of various industries. And this is abundantly true for the medical industrial complex. And we're living with, I think, having been lulled into submission or acquiescence as the big insurers and the pharma have kind of had their way with us. And what's one of the things that's fascinating that's going on right now, my friend Robert, is, as your Maui colleague Ed Dowd has pointed out, we're now seeing a clash of titans emerge because the insurance industry, particularly life insurance, is facing economic collapse consequent to the unanticipated surge of death and disability, which seems to correlate with the onset of vaccination rather than the onset the year before of the virus. And they're not going to put up with that. And they're not going to be okay with this full indemnification of vaccine manufacturers, because they're all going to go bankrupt. And big insurance is now is in a position of duking it out with big pharma, unless, because they're both owned by the same consortiums up above, unless the overseers step in and somehow adjudicate that, because that kind of a financial imbalance cannot persist, right?
Wow. Interesting perspective on that. And it's, just to highlight a theme we cover a lot on this show, but this idea of having a monopoly on money, it drives centralization and wealth disparity. So it seems like all of these centralized powers, beneath all of it is the centralization of money that just causes this excessive growth and asymmetry of power, frankly. I want to drill in here to something. This is something else you brought up on the Rogan show, this idea of hospitals on the topic of depersonalization, by the way. As you said, when we cross the line of, turning human dignity into a row on a spreadsheet or something like that, hospitals receiving these cash bonuses apparently for declaring patients as COVID positive, plus other cash incentives for reporting COVID deaths, putting patients on ventilators. I think there's a whole host of other things.
Remdesivir, treating with remdesivir is another one.
Certain types of treatment. What's going on there? What is the thought process behind issuing those incentives to hospitals? It seems like it's obvious that it would skew the data, because if you're a self-interested hospital, you're going to just put whatever you need to put on the form to get the cash. But what's the other side? I assume this is a government subsidy that's providing this funding.
Correct.
What is the ostensible purpose of that through the lens of government to provide hospital bonus
So
or things like that?
again, you're asking me to project my brain into that of the governmental leaders. I'm going to speculate. Okay, so we're in the land of speculation. We don't know.
Fair enough.
What they were thinking, but we can follow the money, right? And we can look at the data and infer. That's one of the things I learned. So let me say a blanket statement. I actively learn and seek to be more like the investor community in how I approach public health, in the sense that, as Ed Dowd teaches to me, you guys operate with about only 20% of the data that you need to be fully validated. You have to be out at the front edge. Otherwise, you get killed if you wait for the full data set to come in. And so I've always said, in trying to explain my approach to public health and what I wish we would do in epidemics or pandemics and outbreaks, is that if you only operate based on fully validated and verified data, you were always about 6 months behind the front edge of the curve. And you're making decisions that are based on outdated data every single time. We have to be more like traders and analysts and be out at the very front edge of the data, but and then learn from you guys about how to handle risk, because that's the issue. And your world is one of operating in incomplete data, always in a very edgy, forward-looking way, with risk mitigation and chronic anxiety and surveillance for black swans, right? That is how we should approach public health, in my opinion, during periods of rapid transition, which is what an outbreak represents, because you never have enough data. You always have to be making snap decisions based on insufficient information. It's very much like the world you guys live in. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from you and apply in your tools to manage these kinds of outbreaks. So that's, I got off on that riff. I felt necessary at this point to kind of talk about it. Yeah. So that's how I think we should be operating. But what we're in is a situation when an outbreak happens. I can tell you, having been through too many of these things, the fog of war descends, literally. It is very much like a battlefield environment. And what you have, just to continue within that kind of metaphor or analogy space, is in this situation, if you probably know, because you're so up on so many other things, about Event 201. So there has been this series of wargaming. And if you don't understand about that, a good entry point is the Bobby Kennedy book about Tony Fauci. Okay, it's got the back third of the book is basically all about all the war game planning that happened prior to these outbreaks. So the government, together with the World Economic Forum, I'm not kidding you, and Bill and Melinda Gates, and basically a spook shop in Johns Hopkins. I'm sorry, I'm using the slang. CIA funded, backed operation in Johns Hopkins has run a series of war games over years. One of the advantages for Bill Gates, just to put a cap on that one, has been, you'll appreciate as an investor, by participating actively in funding these war game scenarios, he has obtained foreknowledge of future market trends, and he has exploited those. So he's bragged about having, made so much money on this outbreak because he made strategic investments in companies like Pfizer and BioNTech, knowing that this was the technology that was going to be pushed by the government if there was another outbreak. And so he, that all came in big for him. He positions himself as a philanthropist, but he's not. He's really exploiting his monopolistic dominance of world health for personal advancement and wealth in terms of his investment strategy. That's the truth of what's gone on. So they do these war games, And they've come up with plans for how to manage an outbreak. And those all have assumed a highly lethal pathogen and a very effective vaccine, neither of which were true. But then when the outbreak happened, they implemented that in Event 201, that was specifically a war game in 2019, in which they anticipated an outbreak of a novel coronavirus. It was SARS-like. Okay, so this is what leads to Mickey Willis's pandemic and all that. Is it's true, it's incontrovertible, it's out there, it's right out in the open. It's funded by WEF and Bill and Melinda Gates. And they came up with a plan based on these assumptions. And then, to my mind, it's now indisputable that this virus was engineered by EcoHealth Alliance together with the Wuhan lab in an effort to develop a bat vaccine for the best reasons, to make it so that bats are less likely to evolve a highly pathogenic SARS-like virus. That was the logic. And somehow an intermediate stage development of that live attenuated vaccine that they sought to develop with NYDIG money escaped the lab. Was it intentional? Was it out the back door in a dead animal? Was it a technician that got infected? I don't know. But that the rest of that story, I'm about 98% positive on, based on the data and the documents that have come out. So it happened. I got a call from this CIA officer that I've co-published with in the past, Michael Callahan, who for some reason was in Wuhan during the fourth quarter of 2019. Who knows? He was there under cover of his Harvard appointment. And he called me on January 4th and said, Robert, get going. We've got a problem. And what happened was the Govies implemented their plan. Okay. And they were in the fog of war in a deep panic. And that panic was exacerbated, we now know, because of the book published by the head of the Wellcome Trust, in which he describes that he and Fauci and Collins got burner phones. And now we have the published documents that it was known that the assessment was 98% probable that the virus came out of the laboratory that was being funded by Fauci. And Fauci and Collins and the guy in charge of the Wellcome Trust all got on the phone using burner phones and talked about how to mitigate the risk and covered up. And so they pushed out the whole media theme that this was a natural occurring thing and it was bat soup and blah, blah, blah. And we now know that's all a lie. And in that panic stage that apparently lasted through March of 2020, they made a series of snap decisions. And it was in this frantic period. And among those decisions, they decided to implement the plans that they had imagined for this new emerging technology of mRNA vaccines that they'd all got behind and Bill Gates had funded and blah, blah, blah. And Moderna, remember, was originally funded by DARPA for exactly this purpose. And so now it came to fore and they felt it was time to pull the trigger on all this. And what they didn't do that any battlefield commander knows you must do is a battle plan is only as good as until you first encounter the enemy. I don't know who said that, Lao Tzu or somebody.
It's Mike Tyson. Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah, well put. And so they didn't reevaluate their plan based on the ground truth. They just executed it. They're gubbies. Remember, this is not the intellectual creme de la creme. These are folks that basically get paid about 80% of market rate because that's what the government pays, because they want lowest cost, technically acceptable. That's how the contract language is. And so you've got the government staffed in the modern era by people, back in the JFK days. I don't know, I was just a kid then, but we had people that came to government because they really believed in the idea of making the world better and making government better. But now most of our government is staffed by I'm sorry, it sounds arrogant, by second and third tier intellects that are, paid 80% of market rate. And if they were good folks, if they're good, they got to work for Pfizer, or the street, right? And make big bucks. Or they go live in Kauai and run a podcast and do Bitcoin investments because they can make a lot more money for a lot less hassle and they don't have to put up with the bureaucracy. These are people that are driven by the motivation of safety and security and pensions and that kind of logic. That's just the way things are. It's how we've structured our government now. Mm-hmm. And so, no surprise, they aren't creative thinkers. This is a system that doesn't reward that type of personality profile. They run them out. And so we got panic. We got an existing plan. They didn't revise the plan based on the true scenario, through a true threat assessment. And they just kind of mindlessly plugged along with the assumptions that had built into the plan that they just practiced a few months before at Johns Hopkins. And here we are living in our own personal hells as a consequence of this kind of government stupid. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say it. We can speak frankly. You're not Joe Rogan. It's not going to go out to 50 million people. But that's, I understand that the investment community values plain speaking. And we can talk about these kind of structural things in a way that we really can't talk with a general open audience.
Yeah, appreciate that. We very much speak out against statism on this show very clearly, very plain spokenly. I do think, it's the only enterprise in the world that does not derive its revenues from mutual voluntary exchange. Now, I guess we could start to lump in these other industries that are becoming part of the state, right? Like healthcare and whatnot. So to ask again about the cash bonus hospital thing is, that's universal, right? That's every hospital in the country.
Yeah.
Federal. Yeah.
Yep. And behind it, so that's part of. Excuse me. So, in general, by the Constitution, the right. Sorry to sound like a constitutionalist. We're strange bedfellows. We got a Christmas card from Jenny Thomas. What can I say? Who's a lovely person and had a lovely Christmas card. Right, Clarence's wife. But the rules are that powers that aren't mentioned in the Constitution vest to the states, right? And healthcare regulation is one of those. So in general, the rights to regulate medical practice vests with the states. And the way that the FDA gets its mandate is through the authority to regulate interstate commerce. So a case can be made, and I talked about that, 8 years ago, but when Trump came in, but I guess it's 12 years ago now, or 10. A case can be made that these larger states with large economies can set up their own pharmaceutical industries and their own distribution, so long as they don't cross state lines. So the power of the federal government to regulate this whole industry flows from interstate commerce, because they don't have any statutory rights, any constitutional rights to regulate the practice of medicine. So the way they do it, like a lot of things, is they do it by leveraging their federal dollar investment in programs like Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. And so what they have done is said to the hospitals and by extension to the physicians, if you don't play by our rules, then we'll pull your funds.
Yeah.
And you won't be able to get reimbursed for Medicare, Medicaid, and you will go out of business. So that's the fist in the glove there, and that has been leveraged in. You'll recall, I mean, there's all these clips of Nancy Pelosi and Jen Psaki and Joe Biden, and it goes on, and Tony Fauci saying we will never impose mandates and they're not legal and they can't be done, and then they get in office and boom, there we have it. And they enforce it through these kind of financial coercion pathways. But technically, they have no right to regulate the practice of medicine at the state level.
Right.
So that's what they've done, and then you also have the insurance companies, and the other thing so they enforce certain coercions, and at the hospital level with the hospitalists, the federal government has basically said you will only practice medicine the way that NIH tells you to practice medicine. NIH has no statutory right to govern the practice of medicine, and they never have in the past. They're set up to be an R&D agency. They are this whole idea of NIH establishing medical standards for treatment is part of a drive by the federal government to establish basically checklist-based medical practice. So, treatment norms, where it's really driven, at least this is the way my colleagues that are medical practitioners perceive it. It's driven by an interest in trying to move medicine towards a economic model that is more AI driven, so that you can offshore physicians, for example. So you can walk into Walgreens. Here's the vision. You walk into Walgreens and you either pre-keyed in or on site you key in what your symptoms are. And that goes through some sort of a deep learning algorithm and pops up, here's your diagnosis, and this is the approved treatment. And then you have a offshored physician in an emerging economy where their trading has been subsidized by their own government. And he or she pops up on the screen and has a medical license to practice in the United States. And they say, okay, this is what you have, and this is going to be your treatment. And move over to the pharmacist who will check you out and administer the appropriate drugs. That's the vision we're moving towards, is this kind of checklist-based medicine that's kind of a one-size-fits-all, as opposed to the traditional practice of medicine, which is inefficient, absolutely, but has this human quality where a patient, because every patient's different, their psychology is different, their context is different, their social context is different, their physiology is different, and one size absolutely does not fit all. And so that's the art of medicine traditionally, right? And we're at this tension between the art of medicine is intolerably expensive, which is why the insurance companies want to drive this to the lowest common denominator. So primary care physicians, seeing patients should not see them for longer than 5 minutes. And they should only see them for one condition at a time, because every new condition visit can, of course, be billed to the government again, right? And so coming in to see a physician and having a holistic view of their treatment, diagnosis, therapy, et cetera, that's contraindicated with the business model. So this is about profit and the business model and business interests here. And that's what we're seeing is one of the early examples of implementation where the federal government, through the NIH, is asserting its authority to establish a standard treatment protocol for this disease, whatever its stage. And we're clearly seeing, most people don't like the idea that the federal government has mandated that the treatment for COVID is go home and take some Tylenol and come back when your lips are blue. And then we'll put you in the hospital, in the ICU, in the COVID care unit, put you on a vent, pump you up with remdesivir and kill you. because that's kind of what happens, right? And so most of the population now knows, stay the hell out of the hospital, or they're going to kill you. And that is not a paranoid statement. That is what happens, because the hospitalization rate, if you can get on top of COVID within the first 72 hours, is virtually zero. If you delay treatment, then it goes up exponentially. And if you delay treatment past 7 days and you start to really have the pulmonary compromise that puts you into the ICU, then you're in the kind of 15 to 25% mortality rate.
Wow. Whew, that's a lot to take in at once. I just want to highlight here that the financial coercion pathways you mentioned, in my mind, this is doubly insidious, because what's actually funding this financial coercion is coercion itself. It's the coercion of taxation and inflation. That governments are basically stealing from citizens to then go and engage in further financial coercion.
They're transferring wealth. So they are transferring wealth to the hospital system and the pharmaceutical industry through, as you point out, through printing money and pushing it out through various federal incentive programs. All for the best reasons, right? Because otherwise the hospitals would go broke in the face of this enormous threat if we don't subsidize the hospitals. And so therefore we have to subsidize the hospitals, and we're going to do it using new dollars that we're going to print or borrow from China, basically, right?
Yeah.
Or borrow from your community. And yeah, I have learned a lot over so many things over the last 6 months, not the least of which is starting. I'm a toddler in terms of understanding cybercurrency and blockchain, but I get the logic of the need to implement a currency form that is based on something tangible that just cannot be created de novo.
Yeah.
I work with a guy who is behind, among his other things, he's behind the Let's Go Brandon coin. And the Let's Go Brandon coin I find fascinating as an example. And you know what the slang is for this type of cyber currency. Yeah. So we don't need to go there. But the Let's Go Brandon coin, with no intrinsic value, popped at a market cap of 500 billion at one point. Right?
It's crazy.
And 500 million for the LGB coin. And that was all based on, the logic of something is worth what other people will pay for it. Right.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because actually coming into this interview, I kind of feel like a toddler on all these topics. Yeah. So, happy that we all have our domains of expertise, I suppose. Let me ask you then kind of a hypothetical question. In a hypothetical world where no digital censorship is possible, where inflation of the currency supply is not possible, say there's no printing press, right? There's no way to print money, and everyone's holding and using a money that's really hard to tax. Actually, you can't just, it's hard to steal, let's say.
So the vision of blockchain Nirvana.
This is what I would call a Bitcoin Nirvana. So Bitcoin has eaten the world and become all the money. How much would that world change the situation we're in now if there's no censorship, no printing of money, and no stealing of money, frankly, through taxation?
Well, that's why I referred. So I have had the opportunity to learn from people that are not just Bitcoin but blockchain based, and learn from some of their emerging business models. where they make the underlying tools available via the blockchain to any third party so that another company can come in and recreate the business model with some greater efficiency improvement. And you can create incentives for early adopters. I mean, there's a bunch of variations on this business model that is fundamentally built off of the Bitcoin concept, but extending it further. And it is envisioning a new world that is decentralized and verifiable. I'm fascinated by it, and I have a vague sense of naivete. What I can say to that is that plans for using this type of business environment to rebuild a new medical care infrastructure are being actively developed by some of the individuals that we've spoken about off channel. And we are I'm very, so this, as we look forward of people, the positions that I'm interacting with. Remember, I'm the president of a group that represents over 17,000 physicians and medical scientists from all over the world, verified email list. Okay. So when we have the oath, there was 270 physicians that signed the declaration about Spotify and that they should delist Joe Rogan and all that, of which less than 100 turned out to be physicians. In our case, we have 17,000, brave souls that have come out and said, this is wrong. What's going on? And those represent core that we can build off of to try to imagine a new medical enterprise and to imagine one that's built around some of the concepts that you're talking about. And we're actively trying to develop business models that build off of this logic that you're speaking of, and imagining how that logic can be applied to recreating the medical enterprise. And I'm hearing enormous amounts of enthusiasm in the cybercurrency world for how cyber can interact with this medical sphere to enable, for instance, direct payment of physicians so that we reduce the inefficiencies associated with the insurance company bureaucracies. I've noticed in my own world that if you can find, so for instance, just to give an example, I once developed a very odd hernia because I also shoe horses, and one of my draft horses leaned on me and I popped a gut. And I didn't have insurance at the time. This is a few years ago. And so I shopped around for a direct payment option for getting my hernia repaired. And for most hospitals, I got basically, are you crazy? We don't give those numbers. And I found a couple of surgical centers. One was in Nevada, in Las Vegas, because cheap air travel, and one was up in Rockville, and they offered a flat fee service for this hernia surgery. What did we end up paying, Jill? $8,000, $3,500 bucks.
About 14,000 from Emory.
And Emory thought it was going to be at least 14,000 to start. Okay. And bang, there you are, the intrinsic inefficiencies in the current business model versus a direct payment model.
Right.
And I spend well over $2,000 a bloody month for myself and my wife alone. To the insurance companies, there's no way I incur that level of expense. And for me personally, I'm better off than most, I guess. But for me personally, for most medical procedures, it's not too much of a burden to direct pay or do some, shorter term payment agreement, rather than incurring this monthly surcharge that goes into cyberspace
Right.
Um,
Gets eaten
so
up
if we can,
by administrators rather than providers.
so if we can find a business model that allows direct payment of physicians and hospitals for actual costs incurred in providing medical care, and we cut out these third-party entities that are pulling the profit out of the system, then the costs go down big time. There's a whole lot of things in the cyberspace in blockchain that many thinkers are imagining can be adapted to address questions in the medical space, such as blockchain protected medical records. So that medical records, just like you enable, as I understand it, you authorize a Bitcoin transaction, just to use an example, through your wallet, and you give permission, and then the transaction occurs, etc. And that's all traceable because it's blockchain based. Likewise, you can use systems, you can adapt those kinds of systems potentially to enabling the sharing of medical record information, et cetera, upon authorization by a patient. So I am cautiously optimistic that there's an interface between your world and my world that we may have a window right now that may not occur for decades again, where we have a population that's become deeply disenchanted with the current medical care system and is open to reimagining that. And I think, I really try hard to look for any silver lining I can find in this whole shit show that we've been encountering. And I think that one opportunity is that people have become so disaffected and so disenchanted with the healthcare system that there may be a unique business opportunity to reimagine it and implement that.
Well said. I hear you on the potential for technological advance, and although theoretical, there is a lot of promise out there, and I agree with you on that. I'd like to maybe try to reframe the question slightly. So I'm trying to think of what points of leverage or attack surface are being used by, I guess, I don't even know what to call it now, the state, the healthcare establishment. There's some combination of the two. They're using this combination of attacks, right, to force the agenda or impose their wishes on others. The ones that I'm aware of are like digital censorship. They're using printed money to fund that. They're using taxation. I think there might be another one here with medical licensure. Aren't they threatening?
Yes.
I know you said you're
Absolutely.
undergoing something now.
Yep.
My general question is just, is it a holistic view of the attack points that are being exploited right now?
So so you're using different language that I'm used to ask the big how question. So there's the big how question and the big why question. And they interact, they're interrelated. Because you have to be able to answer the big why question to infer the strategy behind the big how question. And so the big why question leads us into this domain that feels very conspiracy-ish. That if you follow that rabbit hole, you seem to always end up at the World Economic Forum for some reason.
Yeah.
And this consortium of transnational corporations that the way I like to frame that issue. When I was younger, way back when in the 80s, when I was more interested in political science, I had read a book called Transnationalism in the New World Order. For some reason, I cannot find that book anymore. I think I may still have it as an archive. transnationalism in the New World Order. We seem to have a situation where these plans that have been implemented in these planning wargaming sessions that have been performed appear to be, there's an awareness that they can serve a broader agenda. Mm-hmm. And this falls into the logic of don't let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to make sense out of the behaviors of, just to pick on somebody, Justin Trudeau, who is clearly documented a product of the World Economic Forum Young Leaders Program, and behaves in alignment with the WEF agenda, and appears to be captured by that logic. And what I think we have, the way I can synthesize this intellectually myself, is that once upon a time, capital was connected to nation state. And that is no longer the case. Capital exists in a transnational environment managed by these large funds that are decoupled from nation state, and they basically roam the world in a way that is agnostic, seeking with no underlying allegiance, seeking only return on investment. That is their driver. That's the reason for existence, is ROI. So they exist in this truly transnational environment where it's irrelevant whether to them whether they can get the best ROI in the People's Republic of China or Malaysia or Vietnam or Mexico or Argentina or fill in the blank. They search the world for opportunities to improve ROI. And they have no moral purpose, no grounding other than the growth of the fund. Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that system, where we talked before about using the language of economics as the sole way to define the human condition, mm-hmm. where we all, you understand the logic of rent-seeking behavior, mm-hmm. Which, I mean, the famous quote from Klaus Schwab, "You will own nothing and you will be happy," mm-hmm. right? This is the ultimate expression of rent-seeking behavior, right? Is we're all renters, basically tithing to large transnational funds that hold all the assets. That's the vision, and it's for our own good, because we're not sufficiently qualified to make our own decisions as individuals, because as we do so, our collective impact on the world through global warming or other things is not sustainable.
I would definitely like to talk to you again, in particular about mass psychosis. Something I've been, as I mentioned offline, writing about, thinking about a lot. And then when you brought it up on the Rogan podcast and it went viral, it was just seemed to be kind of serendipitous.
Okay.
All right,
it's
Robert.
Been a pleasure, Robert.
Yes, likewise. Thank you so much. I look forward to talking again.
Keep thinking.
I will do that. And keep doing the work you're doing. Thank you so much. You're really, I mean, you were very humble to thank Joe, which Joe's made a huge contribution, but likewise to you. You know, it takes a lot of courage to speak truth to power. So thank you very much for that.
Yes, sir. Let's I love to quote Harry Truman. Remember his campaign slogan? They used to say, "Give them hell, Harry," and he would say, "I just tell the truth, and they think it's hell."
Love it. All right, Robert. Thank you so much. I'll be in touch.
Ciao.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.